Education woes from before the COVID-19 pandemic linger as Filipino students return to face-to-face classes. Tens of thousands of classrooms need to be built. Teachers' requests for salary increases remain in limbo. So many students have been left behind because of uneven access to the tools of distance learning. Vice President and Education Secretary Sara Duterte in September claimed that she can solve the gargantuan problems of the Education Department in 6 years if Congress gives her an additional 100 billion to the department's 710 billion share in the National Expenditure Program. The bold declaration brought up the memories of the leadership style of her father, Rodrigo Duterte, the predecessor of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Now, it's a big ask and an even bigger promise. But is it even doable? This is Newsbreak Chats, and we're with Proper's education reporter Bons Magzambol, who's going to break down the how-tos of the Vice President's pledge. Bons, hello.
Hello, Ma'am Inday. Thank you for having me.
Okay, now first off, diretso tayo. Gaano ba kaseryoso? How serious are the problems of the Education Department? I mean, if you were asked to name the top 5 problems, what would this be?
Okay, it's a good thing na yun yung maging start of or jump off ng discussion natin. No? So, sobrang problematic ng education sector natin. So, I'll name you top 5 problems of the education sector. For one, 9 in 10 Filipino children struggle to read a simple text. So this is a
9 in 10?
Yes. So this is a manifestation of learning poverty in the country. So we're among the lowest actually across the world.
Survey said that, yeah.
And then aside from that, 72% of students age 15 are low achievers in math, science, and reading. So this is based from PISA in 2018. And then, aside from that, in terms of infrastructure, we lack 91,000 classrooms for the school year 2022 to 2023. So this is a big problem because millions of students returned to face-to-face classes for this school year. So to make up for the classroom shortage, shifting have been implemented, class shiftings have been implemented, of course, and then blended learning has been allowed in some areas where, of course, there are classroom shortage. And then aside from that, in relation to the lack of classrooms, the Philippines needs 147,000 more teachers just to reduce.
More than 100,000 teachers.
Yes, that's just to reduce the class size to just 35. Because for now, some classrooms have 50 to 80 class size. So
even after the pandemic,
yes.
Even despite the health protocols.
Yes. So, can you imagine paano kaya magkakaroon ng physical distancing in schools whereas, di ba, parang 50 to 80? Health experts say dapat yung ideal classroom size is at 20. Pero we're beyond, we're almost double than the ideal class size. And then aside from that, of course, a total of 425 private schools have permanently closed. So this is problematic in a way because private schools should complement the public schools problems. Of course, if kulang tayo ng mga classrooms or kulang tayo ng mga infrastructures, 'di ba? Yung mga estudyante nag-enroll sila sa private schools.
I remember the government used to give them vouchers, right? To enroll in private schools just to decongest the public schools. I think a few years ago that was.
Yes.
Okay. I don't even know where to start there. Okay, so we've gone through the lack of classrooms, definitely.
Yes.
It's not just a question of 1 meter, it's dikit-dikit, chick-to-chick learning in these classrooms, okay? And then, of course, we have a lot of catching up to do with the learning abilities of our students. As you said, those are the basic foundations of education. And if we're that far down, then we're gonna have a hard time catching up. So, punta tayo doon. Kaya ba masagutan yan ng 100 billion? I mean, in previous Because I'm sure the problem in education isn't new. The problem in
Yes.
learning isn't new, you know. We've had 2 years of the pandemic, and I think Liling Briones, the former education secretary, had mentioned this. So what is needed, example, just for that catching up in terms of learning abilities, how much do we need? Would you know?
Okay, how much do we need? Actually, the global standard is the government should allocate 6% of its gross domestic product or yung GDP natin. Pero currently, yung proposed budget ng Department of Education under the National Expenditure Program is only at 4.3%.
Although it is historically, it does have one, if not the biggest share of the budget,
Yes,
right?
of course.
Okay.
According to the Constitution, the education sector should receive the biggest chunk of the budget. Pero despite that, mababa pa rin yung ina-allocate ng government natin when it comes to the education sector. Actually, itong 4.3%, tumaas pa siya for this year compared to the previous year. During the previous year, actually, during the time of former Secretary Briones, the education sector had only been receiving around 3% of the GDP allocation under the NEP. So medyo tumaas na to. Pero enough ba to? So if kukunin kasi natin yung 6% ng GDP, 6% actually ng GDP, dapat mag-allocate yung Philippine government ng around 1.4 trillion peso. Pero during for this National Expenditure Program for 2023, nag-allocate lang sila ng 710 billion. And of course, Vice President and Education Secretary was asking the Congress for another 100 billion peso.
Parang, ilan nga ba yung kulang ng classrooms?
We lack 91,000 classrooms.
Magkano on the average does a classroom cost, Pons? Would you know?
Wala akong ballpoint figure, pero siguro yung rough estimate na lang. For the 2023 budget, the government only allocated 64 billion to build classrooms. Nang 10,000 classrooms lang yung mabibuild.
Okay, so on classrooms alone, baka maubos na ang pondong kailangan ni
Yes, actually.
Education Secretary Duterte. Okay, so balikan natin yan again. But let's go to doubters, because I do know, like in the House of Representatives, you seem to have, you know, it was a walk in the park for the Education Secretary. But of course, there have been doubters, and especially in the Senate. You've been reporting, you know, on, let's say, Senator Riza Hontiveros, no, and I think on Franz Castro, Representative Franz Castro. So, what doubts do at least these two legislators have on the Secretary's request? Does it actually involve the need, or does it involve doubts over how she's going to use the money?
Okay. Actually, we spoke to Representative Franz Castro, the House Deputy Minority Leader, regarding what happened during the House budget deliberations for the budget of DepEd. Okay, so yung pagmamonitor natin dito, actually nakita natin na parang medyo hindi sumang-ayon, of course, itong minority bloc dito sa paghingi ni Vice President Sara Duterte ng another 100 billion pesos. Because for one, sabi nila, if kailangan talaga ng budget, saan mo gagamitin yung additional 100 billion? Pero Vice President Sara Duterte kasi just said na, I need 100 billion and I will solve the problems of the education sector in 6 years without giving a detailed plan kung saan niya gagamitin tong 100 billion more na to. So sinabi nga ni Representative Castro na if the Vice President was serious about her plans to solve the education problems in 6 years, hindi enough yung 100 billion.
As we say, classrooms pa lang.
Kasi classrooms pa lang, di ba? So, saan niya gagamitin yon? So, of course, tinanong niya during the House deliberation, binalik niya kay Vice President Duterte, saan mo gagamitin yung 100 billion? And then, instead of like, and then nabanggit din actually doon yung, di ba, very insistent kasi si Duterte sa paggagawang mandatory ng ROTC. So, instead of proactively solving the education crisis, why are you very insistent, of course, in pushing for ROTC? And of course, yung sinabi doon ni Vice President Duterte was, meron na daw mga laws for to solve, or meron na daw mga legislation to solve for learning crisis, whereas wala pa daw legislation to make ROTC mandatory. So medyo
Hindi ba
siya-
dapat nauuna gawin ang meron ng legislation? Mapunuan man? Because I think a lot of our problems of our laws, no matter how good they are, is that Congress seems to forget the
Yes.
matter of funding for these laws. So implementation is rather poor. Okay, that's interesting. But did she say how much ROTC? Is there any idea of how much mandatory ROTC is going to cost this country?
Actually, wala pa gaanong detalye na binigay si Vice President Duterte kung paano niya kung paano ma-realize itong plans niya to make ROTC mandatory. Though during the sidelines nitong mga recent media appearances niya, sinabi niya na parang medyo nagbahipidal siya. Sinabi niya na parang better na sa college education gawin yung ROTC, not dito sa basic education. Pero still, ngayon, wala pa rin tayong nakikitang plano kung paano ba to ma-realize, because of course, during the first State of the Nation address ni President Marcos, di ba, priority, nasa priority list niya talaga tong paggagawa ng ROTC bilang mandatory.
But maybe it was a shot to the Vice President. I haven't heard the President really, give much stress on our ROTC.
right.
Maybe, but considering that, I think yung pagtingin ni Sara ni Vice President Duterte na ibalik sa college, I think the reason why she was pushing for it, baka yung assumption that the junior and senior high school years used to be the first and second years of college before.
Yeah.
So baka doon niya pinasok yon, but of course the reason nga why we have more years in basic education is so that the students will be more mature
Yes.
when they get to college. So that parang hindi magkatugma yun. No? Okay. Now, we know that the DepEd, it's not, this relatively tame nga yata, no? Yung mga questions kay Vice President Duterte. Compared to, let's say, you've covered Liling, no? Dr. Briones. What's the difference in terms of the approach of legislators of our budget, are the guardians of our budget?
Okay. Actually, both the House and the Senate are dominated by Marcos allies, right? So, actually, what I've noticed is that when during the budget deliberations under the administration of former Secretary Briones, it usually took like 8 to 10 hours to deliberate the budget of the Department of Education. Pero this time, nung nag-deliberate na itong budget ng DepEd under the Vice President, it only took them 2 hours. And
Really?
then, no questions about how would you address the lack of classrooms, how would you address the erroneous textbooks. Walang mga ganong questions. As in, only 7 lawmakers interpellated Duterte, and then walang mga gaanong questions on how the Vice President would address the learning crisis in the Philippines. So, medyo hindi siya naging, parang hindi nabusisi. That's the right term for yung budget talaga ng Department of Education. And then aside from that, yung way ng pagtatanong ng mga lawmakers is very like sobrang light lang compared kay Liling na parang inuungkat even yung mga problems ng education sector when she started. Ngayon na patapos na, especially nitong last na budget hearing ng 2022. Pero yung kay Vice President Duterte, wala tayo gaanong narinig. Maybe because nagsisimula pa lang or I don't know. Pero yun nga, of course, one reason they cited was parliamentary courtesy raw. Because yun nga daw, she is the Vice President, of course. So, yun yung sinabi nung majority leader nila and then the House Speaker, of course, na let's extend courtesy to the Vice President.
Let's stop there for a while. If we're going to push that to the logical conclusion, what happens in the future when there are huge anomalies, for example, if huge anomalies and scandals break out in the education department, and the House of Representatives needs to scrutinize the budget that it passed, are they still going to exercise that kind of deferential
Courtesy.
treatment?
Okay. Actually, parang dun tayo nagkakaroon ng problema eh. When we talk to House Deputy Leader Franz Castro, sinabi niya na baka daw nga mahirapan sila kasi dito pa lang sa budget deliberations, mabilis na nakapasa sa House level itong budget ng Department of Education. So, paano pa kaya magiging challenge for them, of course, kasi as of now, 20 lang yung members ng minority bloc. I mean, some 20 members lang. So, pero she promised naman na pag nagkaroon ng mga ganitong gipitan or may nakita sila mga mali or loopholes dito, kanila daw, she promised na kanilang bubusisiin pa rin yung budget ng pagkakagastos, of course, ng Department of Education.
Okay. Alam natin na hindi lang yung 100 billion, the extra 100 billion, ang medyo controversial. There are other money issues, that the Vice President faced as Education Department Secretary. Kamusta na yung mahiwagang intelligence fund?
Okay. Ayun. So medyo naging naging usapin to actually sa social media why the Department of Education is asking for 150 million confidential funds. And that's on top of the 500 million confidential funds ng Office of the Vice President. So para saan daw to? So actually ilang beses na nating tinanong during press briefings yung spokespersons niya and even of course Vice President Duterte herself explained kung saan talaga to gagamitin. Of course, confidential funds parang ang hirap paano nga confidential yan, di ba? From the term itself confidential. Pero sabi niya security, surveillance daw and then for the 150 million naman ng DepEd, sinabi na surveillance of teachers na allegedly involved in drugs. So, may mga ganon. And then, aside from that, di ba, naging malaking usapin din yung mga estudyante na naaabuso sexually. So, they would use the funds now to make schools a safe space, again, para sa mga estudyante. So, ito yung mga broad na sagot ng Office of the Vice President at ng Department of Education kung saan nila gagamitin itong confidential funds.
The matter of safe spaces, punta natin, isa-isa na, let's break it down. The matter of safe spaces, is this a issue of a lack of confidence or an issue of non-implementation of, as the Vice President says, laws that are already there? And shouldn't that be an above-board, transparent implementation of policies instead of confidential proceedings? Parang ganun. I mean, of course, we know that minors, when they do come in and complain, those proceedings should be confidential. But that's different from saying you need confidential funds for this. Di ba? Magkaiba yun eh. Ganon. And drugs.
And then aside from that, sinabi din of course ni Vice President Duterte that the confidential fund will be used para dito sa terrorism, recruitment. So yeah,
Okay, here, anong pananaw mo dyan? When the Vice President speaks of terrorism, recruitment, Bons, ano yung pananaw mo doon? Can you parse that out? What does it mean?
I think what the Vice President failed to realize is that we're talking about basic education students here. So how do you recruit? I mean, paano nagkakaroon ng recruitment dito sa terrorism among the basic education students, 7 years old, 8 years old, 10 years old, diba? And then, yung sinabi naman niya dito is para daw to sa mga teachers na nare-recruit as terrorists or nagiging parte ng NPA.
Sa totoo lang, sa haba ng panahon, ilang teachers ba ang naging NPA? Can we even count? On the fingers of two hands? Or is she equating terrorism with militant legal organizations?
I think parang dito ngayon, sa konteksto natin ngayon, parang doon papunta. parang kapag naging rebelde ka or naging aktivista ka, you're part of, di ba? Parang may ganun kasing notion ngayon eh. So I think ganun din yung nangyayari.
So, kumbaga, the Education Secretary is veering towards law enforcement issues na ito.
Actually.
No? Ganun. And, of course, we all know that it's a whole-of-nation approach, but a big portion... But speaking of law enforcement, what did Senator Hontiveros have to say to this intelligence fund?
Okay, right. Just recently, diba, like yesterday, October 4, opposition Senator Risa Hontiveros says na mas malaki pa yung intelligence funds na hinihingi ng Department of Education compared sa sa Intel agency natin na 141.2 billion lang, which is ito yung agency na concerned talaga sa national security.
Is this DICA, the coordinating agency? Okay.
So, sabi niya, bakit mas malaki pa yung parang hindi naman reasonable yon na Department of Education should focus on educational reforms rather than the national security. So, bakit mas malaki yung funds na hinihingi ng Department of Education compared sa NICA?
I'm actually kasi wondering and trying to follow the Vice President's logic, di ba? If she needs 150 million to chase after potential or existing terrorists in schools, what's going to stop the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health, the Department
and other
and all other agencies from asking as much, because everybody thinks that there are terrorists lurking under behind every post. Oh, but anyway, sige, you're covering Sara Duterte not just as Education Secretary, but as the Vice President of the Republic. Have you noticed any differences in the way, let's say, she speaks or she approaches policymaking in both these roles?
Okay. I would say wala gaanong pagkakaiba yung Sara as the Vice President and Sara as the Education Secretary. But I would say she's very hands-on as the DepEd Chief. So, she's present in almost every DepEd event. As in, kahit saang school, kahit pinupunahan niya talaga.
Kahit maliit.
Kahit maliit na school. And even yung mga, siguro yung mga first few days niya as DepEd Secretary, pinuntahan niya talaga yung mga classrooms na nasira ng recent typhoons. So, ganun siya ka-hands-on. And after all, she's a mother, right? I
And
mean,
that's going to
yes.
get her really big brownie points from parents, of course.
Yes, she's a mother, and then of course meron siyang mga anak din na nag-aaral. So of course, yung thinking ng isang mother, 'di ba, kailangan maganda yung education ng anak ko. So kailangan nating ayusin.
And she stressed that when she won, right?
Yes.
After she won, that's what she was stressing, di ba? Family values, the safety of our children, etc. Okay.
Pero like, when she was appointed as the DepEd Secretary, many raised their eyebrows actually. Kasi she's not an educator. And then, the problems of the education sectors are much complex than it seems. Diba? Sobrang lalaki kasi nung problem na to. Pero of course, sinabi ni President Marcos, ginustify niya yung pag-a-appoint niya kay Duterte na si Duterte daw could capitalize on her experience as a mayor. Kasi, di ba, very hands-on yung mga chief local executives natin eh. And of course, ayun nga, yung pagiging hands-on niya, she get things done. Pero of course, different naman kasi yung pagli-lead ng isang department na merong malalaking problema, lalo na't wala kang expertise dito. So ito yung naging critic naman sa kanya ng mga tao.
So jumping from a local executive position to a national executive position, which was also the trajectory of her father, you know, the former president. Now, who of course is famous or infamous, depending on where you are in the political divide, for saying that he would rid the country of the problem of illegal drugs in 3 to 6 months.
Yes.
When Sara was Davao City Mayor, even when she started to campaign for the vice presidency, she tried her best to distance herself from the president's branding, you know. Do you think she realizes that the continuing popularity of her father means, a little tweaking, or is she a true believer in her father's iron fist policy?
Actually, 'di ba, parang during the elections, yung election period, parang napansin talaga natin na dumidistansya. So, 'di ba, meron tayong story na Sara Duterte, the other Duterte, kasi ayaw niya talagang ma-associate. Pero kasi with the political landscape that we have now, parang ang hirap na madistansya na si Duterte, yung popularity, of course, ng tatay niya, and then of course, she is Sara Duterte. Mahirap iwalay eh. Mahirap i-distansya talaga yung pangalan niya doon sa kanyang tatay, doon sa brand of leadership. And during the House deliberations nga nitong budget ng DepEd, marami nagulat. Kasi akala ko ba dinidistansya mo yung pangalan mo or yung leadership style mo sa tatay mo, and then you promise to solve, di ba? Parang very, sounds familiar actually yung in 6 years, di ba? Pero this time kasi meron silang meron budget na inilagay si Vice President Duterte na 100 billion. Pero in fairness naman kay Vice President Duterte, actually, feeling ko hindi niya lang totally na-explain kung bakit, how she came up with the 100 billion. This 100 billion kasi, yung original na budget proposal ng Department of Education was 810 billion. Pero na-slash siya ng 710. Na-slash siya ng 100 billion nung napasama na siya sa NEP. So, ayun, yung 810 billion kasi, part siya ng BEDP or the Basic Education Continuity Plan to solve the education problems until 2030. So, dapat year by year, progressive yun eh. Mag-a-add ng 100 billion this year and then another 100 billion sa next year hanggang ma-reach nila yung ideal budget para sa Department of Education.
So, you're actually saying what the Vice President and Education Secretary was saying was, return to us the monies that were in the department budget, proposed budget, and were taken away by the NEP, which Malacanang finalizes. So, ganon. So, klaruhin lang natin, just to, also to give the benefit, and, to be fair, no? Ang sinasabi ng Vice Pangulo at ng kalihim ng Education Department, ay ibalik nyo. Itong paghingi niya ng 100 billion was ibalik nyo ang pera na nandyan na yan sa budget ng DepEd na pinasa sa Malacanang, pero tinap-chop ng palasyo na siya ang gumagawa ng NEP, at nagpapadala nito sa Kongreso, at sinasabi niya na kailangan ito dahil meron ng plano na yan, medium term, long term plans na yan every year.
But ang naging problem kasi dito, when Duterte said that dun sa Congress, hindi niya ma-explain kung bakit niya kailangan ng 100 billion. I mean, she was given a lot of opportunity, of course, to explain kung bakit 100 billion yung hinihingi niya. Marami namang press conference after that budget deliberations kung saan niya gagamitin yung 100 billion. But then, hindi siya makapagbigay ng concrete plans. Saan natin to bakit 100 billion?
Talking about Malacanang, maganda yung punto mo, no? Maybe a little less macho and a little motherly and a little, womanly would make her more careful about presenting, yung mga ins and outs of the needs of DepEd. But talking about kinaltas, may isang controversy rin, di ba? Yung parang maraming nagreklamo na bakit inalis nyo DepEd ang pondo para sa mga PWDs, right? Na mga estudyante. And maganda yung sagot nila, di ba? Doon ko lang na-realize din yun, na ay, ganun pala. Sige nga, explain mo.
Sige, I'll take this opportunity na rin to explain what happened there. Kasi yung budget sa SPED, hindi siya totally ibig sabihin wala ng education na mangyayari para sa mga special students natin or students with disabilities. Yun nangyari lang dito, meron pa kasing mga unobligated funds or hindi nagamit or may mga funds na natitira pa before na pwede pang gamitin ngayon. That's why hindi na sila nag-allocate ng pondo pa para dito. So, ayun. So, that necessarily mean na wala tayong gagamitin na funds doon.
That, those positions, they do sound reasonable.
Yes.
Both from yung 100 billion, why do you think hindi ganun kaayos ang messaging ng not only of DepEd, but of course the secretary who heads it?
Actually, parang nakikita natin dito, of course, papunta pa lang tayo dito sa first 100 days. Baka parang napapansin din namin kasi na hindi pa rin nasi-streamline yung communication or yung functions niya as Department of Education Secretary at the same time as the Vice President. Like, for example, yung experience namin as reporters, nahihirapan kami, kanino ba namin kukunin itong question na to? Dito ba kasi for context, meron siyang spokespersons sa parehong offices at magkaiba yon. So, hindi pa masyadong streamlined actually yung communications nila. And in terms of messaging, hindi din medyo yun yung parang kailangan nilang i-improve on kasi hindi talaga siya masyado pang 'di ba parang okay naman kasi yung 'di ba yung intention, pero the way they communicated it sa public parang hindi talaga siya.
Because I think as Mayor Duterte, the Vice President used to have these radio programs where she would speak and filter. You know, she would be able to talk as she sees fit. Ganon, no? So parang hindi sanay sa give and take of the hurly-burly of national media siguro. Okay, so that's great na, you know, you were able to clarify or at least shed some lights on some of the more controversial aspects of the Vice President's tenure as young tenure as Education Secretary. So we're running out of time, Bon, but let's say, given all that, ano ang takeaway mo sa first 100 days ni Vice President Duterte as Education Secretary, both the good and the bad?
Okay. Sige. Siguro yung good muna, yun munang magaganda. Napansin ko with Vice President Duterte, seryoso siya. I mean, it's her job. Isa ng practical example dito is she issued a strong order mandating all schools to return to face-to-face classes. I mean, experts had been saying that we need to open schools quicker kasi di ba under the leadership of former Secretary Briones, natatagalan talaga kasi yun nangyari dito. Masyadong bottom-up approach yung ginagamit nila na lagi may blanket policy. Pero of course, hindi naman, different naman yung context ng bawat lugar. Different of course yung exposure ng virus ng bawat lugar. So yun, maganda yung she issued a strong order talaga na nakatanggap din naman ito ng praises of course sa mga tao.
But that order also allows those vulnerable areas to opt out, di ba? Or at least may blending pa rin.
Meron silang, di ba? Meron pa rin blended learning sa mga lugar, for example, na hindi talaga kayang mag face-to-face classes pa because for one, na-damage yung mga schools nila due to typhoons. And then there are instances din na wala din naman talaga, wala classroom. So pwede silang mag-blended learning.
Okay.
So aside from that, I would say then na yung experience niya as mayor, dinala niya dito sa pagiging VP niya at sa pagiging Education Secretary. Katulad na lang na parang hindi ang hirap kasing ihiwalay na si Sara Duterte bilang Education Secretary at bilang VP. Kasi sa lahat ng pupuntahan niya, dala-dala niya yung pagiging VP niya. Like for example, may school siya na pupuntahan. Hindi lang estudyante yung kakausapin niya doon, pero she would reach out to other sectors of the society as well. Like for example, yung mga tao na nangangailangan ng burial assistance. As in, kapag nasa school siya, isang package na yun. Sama-sama na sila doon. So, ayun. And then, but on the bad, yung bad side naman, wala tayo na naririnig na concrete plans kay Vice President Duterte kung paano niya i-resolve or paano niya susolusyonan itong learning crisis in the Philippines. Except for, ito yung isa niya sinabi, na magkakaroon daw siya ng National Reading Program to address the reading comprehension.
We have our National Reading Program.
Meron pa, pero hindi siya institutionalized na isang nationwide. Pero ayun, pero wala pang details na sinabi. And then aside from that, I would say that she needs to hold dialogues with other sectors as well, especially the teachers group. 'Di ba? Kasi parang sila yung may alam eh. I mean, 'di ba, alam natin for a fact na Vice President Sara Duterte is not an educator. So para mas magampanan niya sana yung function niya as DepEd Secretary, it would help her na makipag-usap siya sa mga teachers group. Kasi katulad dun sa SONA, while President Marcos Jr. Said a lot of promising policies for the education sector, teachers' welfare was left out. So wala silang narinig in terms of paano ba natin patataasin yung sweldo ng mga teachers natin na for years, 'di ba? Katulad sa healthcare na parang umaalis na yung mga teachers natin in their quest for better working conditions. And then yung narinig lang natin of course sa kanya is hindi daw nila pwedeng itaas bigla-bigla yung sweldo ng mga teachers sa public kasi that would mean marami daw magmamigrate from private schools to public schools. So, 'di ba? So medyo
Why don't they give private school subsidies? I mean, why
diba?
stop there?
Parang yun yung naging solution niya doon. And then aside from that, ito din yung height ng typhoon. Siguro ito yung bad side din. Di ba, nag-viral siya during the height of nitong Typhoon Carding. Not because she was doing relief services or relief efforts for those affected by the typhoon. Pero nag-viral siya because of her video speaking in Mandarin.
Oh.
Diba? So it was an attempt, of course, to be friends with the Chinese. Pero nag-drew siya ng flock because maraming mga tao yung nagsasabi na mali naman yung pagkakagawa ni Vice President Duterte, pag-speak niya or yung pagsasalita niya ng Mandarin. So, ayun. So, diba, maraming memes na nakita tayo sa social media. So, ayun. Yun yung mga sa tingin ko na kailangan pang ayusin ni Vice President Sara Duterte as the DepEd Secretary and as the Vice President. And of course, ito pala, huwag natin kalimutan na she is the only VP din who created satellite offices ng OVP across the Philippines. So we have 7
How is that going on?
Okay, actually, yung sinasabi niya is parang itong mga satellite offices na to, ito yung move niya para mas mapalapit yung mga tao sa OVP. Pag may mga kailangan sila, hindi na nila kailangan pumunta sa Maynila kasi di ba dito lang yung office. Pero of course, we have one in Bacolod, in Davao, and someone in up north. So merong mga ganon. So yung nandun is yung burial assistance, medical assistance, and then yun. So yun yung mga services na ino-offer ng OVP dun sa mga satellite offices niya.
Okay, that's not necessarily a bad thing to be
Yes.
nearer the people. No, it just depends on who actually gets what from
Yes.
the office of the Vice President. We're hoping that everybody has access to this and not just those who toe the line of the government, as well as with the budget of the Education Department. That was very enlightening, Bons. Maraming salamat. We wish, of course, the Vice President and the Education Secretary the best of luck. The last thing anyone wants is a failed Education Department because sabi nga ni Jose Rizal, dyan ang gagaling ang pag-asa ng bayan, you know. So that's it. Maybe after 200 days, we'll be back to explore more of her achievements or failures, whatever they may be. Thank you, Bons.
Thank you so much, Inday.